Mysteries of ages past, unenlightened shadows cast down through all eternity, the crying of humanity. 'Tis then when the hurdy-gurdy man comes singing songs of love. Then when the hurdy-gurdy man comes singing songs.
Are you threatening the druids?
I'm warning you.
You remind me of someone. Someone I met a long time ago.
And who's that?
Julius Caesar. What happened to him?
Do we have a deal?
Gods don't deal, Rome. The gods don't deal. Is he ready? Nearly. Very nearly.
Who's your skinny friend? No friend of mine. Forward!
Mysteries of ages past, unenlightened shadows cast down through all eternity, the crying of humanity. 'Tis then when the hurdy-gurdy man comes singing songs of love.
Good morning, guys. It is 12:05 on Wednesday the 20th of April 2022. So it has been a little while since I've made a podcast, and that's because of a couple of things. The weather has been pretty bad. It's heading into winter now, so filming outside is becoming a bit of a problem. Wind and rain. Sunny today, but it's the first sunny day we've had in some weeks. And the other thing is COVID is ripping through New Zealand at the moment, and there are tons of people off work on mandatory isolation because of having COVID. So for example, the place I work at, there's a lot of people doing double shifts and long hours and stuff like that, so it's a pretty exhausting time at the moment. Nevertheless, after a lot of mucking about and one attempt at going for a paddle at the lake and filming this when the weather collapsed, here we are with podcast number 49. And you'll notice, if you haven't already, that the order of the podcast is wrong at this point. The last podcast I made, I erroneously called it podcast 50 when it was actually 49. And because YouTube doesn't allow you to swap around the order of your podcasts, they just stay in the order that you upload them. So you'll notice that on my video page on my YouTube channel, podcast number 49 is going to come after podcast 50. So this is another requested subject. Someone asked me to talk about this. They actually asked me to talk about a couple of individuals, important historic individuals in relation to laboratory alchemy. And I've decided for this video not to try and cram all the information about each of those people into one video, but I'm going to split them up. So because he comes first in history, this podcast is going to be about Raymond Lully. And we're going to talk a little bit about his biography and a little bit about his place in history and his importance in the tradition. I know I've touched on the subject before, but we're going to just dive a little bit deeper into it now. Let's first discuss why Raymond Lully is so important to the Western Hermetic tradition. And first of all, it might be a good idea if I explain a little bit about who he is. He was actually born in Spain, in Mallorca, and his name was probably originally pronounced Raymond Lully, L-U-L-L, but it's been Anglicized in the Western Hermetic tradition to Raymond Lully. And to stick him in his proper place in history, we need to understand a few things about what was happening before he became an important figure, and during and after. So our benchmark for considering timing in Western Hermetic history is the First Crusade, because there are no preserved instances of any kind of serious alchemical writings or teachings or practice in the Western Europe before the First Crusade. And one of the arguments is that the Knights Templar were probably among the main people responsible for bringing knowledge of alchemy into Western Europe, although it's probably accurate to make the guess or the claim that other religious figures, maybe other aristocrats of the time, knights that were involved in the crusade, may have also played a role in bringing alchemical knowledge into Western Europe during the First Crusade. So the First Crusade took place from 1096 till 1099. So that's the end of the 9th century. We also need to be aware that the Templars were founded as an order in 1119. So the First Crusade had been fought and won well before the Knights Templar were established. It's something which is often not clearly pointed out. Then the Second Crusade, which the Templar order would have obviously been involved in, raged from 1147 till 1150. The very first alchemical book to come from the Middle and Near East into Western Europe was translated by a man called Robert of Chester. So he was an Englishman, but he was what was called an Arabist. In other words, he translated books that were coming in from the Middle East, from Arab culture, into Latin and probably other languages as well. So he translated a book called The Composition of Alchemy. In other words, it was an explanation of what alchemy actually was. And the Latin name for that book was Liber Compositione Alchemiae. And he translated that book, or it was published, I think in February of 1144. So let's remember that the Second Crusade started in 1147. So the first book on alchemy to come into Western Europe came into Western Europe 3 years before the Second Crusade was launched. And of course, the Knights Templar had already been firmly established for roughly 20 years by the time that first book in alchemy was translated into Latin, probably from Greek or Arabic, and brought into Spain and then made its way through Western culture. All of these dates and those events are very important because they are the very foundation of the Hermetic alchemical tradition in Western Europe. When we talk about the kinds of things that are possible in alchemy, the kinds of things that were most likely to be happening in early Western alchemy, we need to know about the history of what was going on and how this knowledge entered Europe in order to have an accurate understanding of claims made about the kinds of things that were practiced and the kinds of things that were known about alchemy when it first came into Western Europe. So it wasn't for another almost 100 years until the first very clear texts were being produced, writings were being produced in the West on the subject of alchemy. 1144 is when the first book discussing what alchemy was about entered Western Europe. And then we find two of the most important authors that discussed the details and practice of alchemy in a Western setting and in Western language and metaphor, allegory, and relating it to the Christian tradition. The first two people that we really know of that had a major impact on the beginning of the serious discussion and practice of alchemy were Raymond Lully and a man called Arnold de Villanova. And these two guys lived basically at the same time. Raymond Lully was born in 1232 and died in 1315, more or less. And he's the historically famous Raymond Lully. And Arnold de Villanova was born in 1245 and died in 1310. So these guys were completely contemporary. They almost lived at exactly the same time for the same period of time as well. And when we compare their writings about the practice of alchemy, we find that they're basically both discussing the same thing. So we have two guys in the 12 and 1300s who were the first people to talk about alchemy after 100 years of it being studied and practiced in Western Europe. And they're the first guys who are talking about basically not only the development of the understanding of alchemy over that 100 years since more or less the Second Crusade until their time, but they were also the first guys to present their development and understanding of laboratory alchemy as it came into Western Europe from the Near and Middle East during the period of the Crusades. So this is why Raymond Lully and Arnold de Villanova are such important people, because they give us a snapshot in time of what alchemy was like in Western Europe after 100 years of people mucking about with it and trying to understand it from texts that were being brought in from a completely different culture, and also starting to develop an understanding of alchemy that didn't come from like an Arabic Muslim culture, but which developed in a Christian culture, the Christian culture of the Holy Roman Empire in Western Europe. So although there are definitely things about alchemy at the time of Lully and de Villanova that we can say were imported almost verbatim from the Middle East, there is also an overlay of Western development and understanding of alchemy and the practice of presenting information about alchemy in a more Western and Christianized format, if you like. So because Raymond Lully and Arnold de Villanova were working at the same time and practicing the same, let's say, version of laboratory alchemy, which is what we today call the acetate path, and which they called the work of Saturn, or the vegetable stone work, we can fairly safely say that from the information we have left by these two guys, that there probably was not any other version or path to the Philosopher's Stone that was effective and successful and well known at that time. Otherwise, these two guys probably would have at least mentioned it in their writings, or at the most explained in detail. They had a very specific system which they were discussing, and their views of that system were in agreement, and there is no hint about other approaches to dealing with the production of the Philosopher's Stone. This is very important. Okay, so now let's look primarily at Lully, because his situation is very confusing if you don't know the history. And for anybody who wants to dive deeper into this subject, I highly recommend a book by Arthur Edward Waite on the subject of Raymond Lully. I think it's just entitled Raymond Lully, and it's not a very big book, but it's Waite's biography, history, and his own ideas about some knowledge and information which he discovered about Lully himself, a little bit of which I'll mention shortly. I didn't know that Waite had published a book on Lully, but I found a copy online in PDF format, so if you search hard enough you should be able to find it if you're interested. And it's pretty much one of the most detailed and interesting explanations of Lully's life and work from an esoteric point of view. And that's important because most of what's known about Raymond Lully is to do with the original Raymond Lully's Christian life. So let's discuss that side of it now. So 1232 to 1315 was when the historic and original Raymond Lully lived, and he was born in Majorca, and he came from a family of nobles, and he was hobnobbing in high society in Spanish culture, in Spanish society, and he became obsessed with becoming a Christian missionary and made it his life's work in the Christian interest side of his life to convert Muslims into Christianity. And so we're talking about him being a missionary some 60 years after the end of the Second Crusade. So the original historic Raymond Lully was most famous for two things: being a zealous Christian missionary and making trips into the Middle and Near East to try and convert Muslims. And eventually they got so angry at him for trying to convince them to be Christians that he was actually stoned to death in Algeria, I think. Muslims don't appreciate people trying to convert them into Christianity any more today than they did back in the time of Raymond Lully. The second thing he was famous for is that he was an intellectual, and he designed at least one very important, but I think actually a number of important systems of logic about how to reason about the world, and he particularly wanted to use these systems of logic in order to explain the reasoning behind the Christian Gospels. So he also became very famous for that. Now, one of the things that we are told about the original Raymond Lully was that at some point he wrote that he didn't believe in alchemy, and he didn't believe in the production of the Philosopher's Stone. He didn't think that they were real things. And so he either seriously disliked the whole subject, or he at the very least had no interest in it. So Christians, particularly Catholic Christians, because of course in those days Raymond Lully was a Catholic missionary, he wasn't a Protestant, because Protestantism hadn't been created at that time. Catholic Christians are adamant that all the claims by the Hermetic tradition that Raymond Lully was an alchemist are false, because Lully wrote in his work somewhere that he didn't believe in alchemy. Now, one of the problems with that is that any person who is familiar enough with the Hermetic tradition knows that many alchemists in the early era of the Western Hermetic tradition were not always keen to admit that they were involved in alchemy, particularly if what they were learning about it was received from an initiate or from a secret society. They would often have had to take an obligation, the upshot of which was that they would possibly lose their life if they revealed the secrets that they were being taught and the people who they were associating with in the esoteric tradition. So if the original Lully was actually an alchemist, it wouldn't have been unusual for him to deny that. And since in his writings he didn't rant on and on about how false alchemy was and how much he didn't believe it, but he made a passing mention almost that he didn't believe it, there's a possibility then that he could have been practicing alchemy, or at least have been studying it and had an interest in it. Although he had an extremely busy life. Being an academic, he was involved in the study in universities, and he was also a member of the Spanish court, so he was involved in a lot of political intrigue and things like that. And then there was his missionary work. And it's not altogether unlikely, though, that he came across discussions of laboratory alchemy when he was in the Middle East trying to convert Muslims to Christianity. Nevertheless, the standard and particularly academic attitude about the original Raymond Lully was that he was not an alchemist. So then we have a bunch of writings from more or less the time of the original Raymond Lully, which discuss laboratory alchemy in detail. And it's a comprehensive and complex system of alchemy that's being discussed there. And part of the discussion in those documents that have the name of Raymond Lully on them as their author are references to Arnold de Villanova. So whoever wrote those texts claiming to be Raymond Lully as the author of those texts was also familiar with, or possibly even meeting with and having discussions with, Arnold de Villanova at the same time, another famous, learned and influential alchemist of the 1200s and 1300s. But the generally accepted rule about all of this now is that the original Raymond Lully was not an alchemist, and that these texts which bear his name were written more or less just after, or at the end of, and then just after the original Raymond Lully's life. So one of the claims that has been made about these texts, when the question is asked, why would the dude who have written them put Raymond Lully's name on them as an author, was that maybe the guy who wrote these texts was Raymond Lully's son. He had children, and at least one of them was a boy. This argument is not seriously entertained. I don't know really of anybody who has made the claim, the serious claim, that Raymond Lully's son was the guy, was practicing alchemy, was very knowledgeable in it, and was the guy who published the alchemical texts under the name of Raymond Lully. I don't know of anybody who really seriously has made that claim. But it's one of the things which certainly has been considered, and A.E. Waite brings it up in his book on the life of Raymond Lully, life and work of Raymond Lully. One of the other claims that has been made about how these alchemical texts came about is that Raymond Lully had a love affair with a woman called Ambrosia. He was obsessed with her, and that a claim had been made, I think by Eliphas Levi, that because she was unwell with cancer and was slowly dying, that she actually harassed him into studying laboratory alchemy in order to discover the elixir of life so that he could cure her of her cancer. And so he practiced alchemy in secret in order to appease her and win her heart. So part of the story claims that she said, I know you love me and you want to have a relationship with me, but I won't allow that to happen unless you succeed in making the Philosopher's Stone. So as far as I know, it was Eliphas Levi who concocted that story, and again, there are really no other authors who have brought that possibility up as a viable claim on the debate about whether or not the original Lully was actually an alchemist, but he was keeping it secret, and that he did it because Ambrosia basically blackmailed him. It's not hard to accept or to understand that there's a well-developed recognition that Eliphas Levi concocted a lot of stories and fabricated a lot of concepts, ideas and history in his alchemical books, which played such a huge influence on rebirthing, or the attempt at rebirthing, the modern Western Hermetic mystery tradition. And Waite certainly, and other people I would assume as well, including myself, insist that Levi's belief that this bribery by Ambrosia is the solution to the question of whether the original Lully was an alchemist or not is the real story. I don't believe it. Waite doesn't believe it, and I would think probably most other people don't believe it either. So either way, what we have is a body of texts, and there are quite a number of them, that describe alchemy kind of in general, but mostly advanced alchemy and the process for making the Philosopher's Stone in detail and in depth. In other words, it's a complex system that's being described in these texts, which are attributed to somebody who called himself Raymond Lully. So the academic practice now, when we discuss Raymond Lully, is to refer to the second guy, whoever wrote these texts, as being the pseudo Raymond Lully. And the debate about whether or not the original guy wrote those texts or how that body of text actually even came about is still an open question for anybody who's interested in the whole subject. There's been no even really well-defined argument about who the author of those texts really was. So Waite, in his book, also presents the idea that there was a third person involved in the Raymond Lully tradition, and that third person wrote a number of texts which were of a mystical nature. In other words, they weren't Catholic Christianity, and they weren't academic in the way that the first Raymond Lully wrote a lot of academic texts. They also weren't laboratory alchemical, but they were part of the mystical Hermetic tradition. And Waite posits the idea that these mystical texts were not written by the guy who wrote the laboratory texts. And that's quite possible, but it's also very difficult to tell, because we don't know in any kind of detail what kind of condition the Western Hermetic tradition was in at the time of Arnold de Villanova and Raymond Lully. We don't know how many people that were interested in alchemy were only involved in the lab tradition, and how many were involved in the lab tradition but were also involved in the internal tradition. But we do know that in the Middle East, at the time when alchemical knowledge was being brought into Western Europe, usually through Spain and Portugal, that the Muslims and the Sufis and other people in the Middle East who were involved in the practice of the ancient alchemical tradition, we do know that those people had a mystical tradition, and that it revolved around the use of visualization and the imagination in order to bring about a state of illumination. There's enough knowledge preserved to us today to know that inner work tradition existed at the time of Lully and Arnold de Villanova, and that it was an old tradition, that it existed well before their time as well. And so part of the corpus of knowledge of Western Hermetic alchemy states that when the laboratory work came in 1144, in that first book by Robert of Chester, that somehow around that same time the mystical tradition would have also been brought into Western Europe. And this is what may have interested the monastic tradition, such as the Knights Templar and other monks who were going to the Middle East because of the Crusades, particularly because they wanted to be involved in the liberation of Jerusalem, and they wanted to be involved in hanging out in Jerusalem because of the importance of that city, that those people who came across the laboratory alchemical tradition would have also come across the inner work tradition as well, and it may have been that side of it which they first latched onto, and then that made them curious about the relationship between the inner work and the laboratory work, and so they brought both traditions back with them into Western Europe. But we don't know whether people like Raymond Lully or Arnold de Villanova even knew about the inner work tradition, although I personally believe it would have been highly unlikely that they didn't know about it, even if they weren't interested in it. But what A.E. Waite states and claims is that the mystical texts, and I'm not sure exactly what it is that he's referring to because I've never seen any of these texts, that also come under the name of Raymond Lully and are written at the same time, more or less, as the alchemical texts, the lab texts, that they must have been produced by a separate individual than the lab guy. But we have to also recognise that Waite was not initiated into the laboratory tradition, even though out of all of the people in the modern Western Hermetic tradition, especially the revival era of the modern Western Hermetic tradition, and out of all the people who got involved in the Golden Dawn, which was probably the key fraternity that was driving the impetus for the renovation of the Western tradition, out of all the people that were involved in that whole mishmash of occultism in Europe at that time, Waite was one of the few people who not only was interested in alchemy, but had some kind of reasonable idea about what alchemy really was. We don't really know whether Waite was hobnobbing with anybody who was practicing laboratory alchemy, but he certainly didn't deny the laboratory side of it. He wasn't one of those people who, for example, was influenced by the Jungian tradition and then so claimed that ancient and traditional alchemy was really a form of psychology. Waite wasn't like that. He recognised that the lab tradition was a real thing. But he didn't really understand, as far as we know, exactly what the laboratory tradition is, even though a lot of his knowledge about alchemy was all through his various works on Western Hermetic tradition. I feel personally that whoever the guy is that wrote the alchemical texts under the name of Raymond Lully, who academics refer to as the pseudo-Raymond Lully, I think it is actually quite possible and viable that he was also the guy who wrote the mystical text, because there are aspects of the Lullian alchemical writings which show a knowledge that is not being seriously presented in detail of the mystical Christian view of alchemy. And this is the next part of the Lullian corpus, which it is important to discuss and understand. That these texts that were written under the name of Raymond Lully were written describing chemical knowledge in an allegorical, metaphorical and symbolical language to some degree. Not all of it is written in symbolism, metaphor and allegory, but all through the writings are sprinkled allusions to an overall view of the acetate path, which is linked to mystical Christianity and to an initiated view of how Christians viewed the allegorical laboratory process. So, for example, the whole concept of Lully discussing core secrets of the acetate path using the language of viticulture, which is growing grapevines, the farming of grapevines, and enology, which is the science of making wine. Lully used reasonably common language derived from viticulture and enology as a code language for discussing core secrets of the acetate path. It's probably quite likely that he was not the first person to invent this way of storytelling about the acetate path. It is quite possible that he inherited this winemaking viticulture allegory storytelling process, structure, format from the Middle East. In other words, Middle Eastern alchemists could have also been using this winemaking and viticulture language to conceal the secrets of the acetate path as well. We don't know that for sure because there are no surviving records which show that Middle Eastern people had a tradition of storytelling about the acetate path that revolved around viticulture and winemaking, but it is something that they wouldn't have been adverse to. But certainly as far as Western culture was concerned, at the time when Lully and Arnold de Villanova were studying and practicing the acetate path, the whole winemaking and viticulture storytelling structure and dynamic is something that which is deeply related to esoteric Christianity, since Christ made references to his relationship with God and God's relationship to him and the relationship of initiates and lay people to Christ and to the church in the form of viticulture and winemaking language. We see that stuff spread through the Old Testament. There's not a lot of it, but there's enough of it to make us quite sure that Christ himself, amongst his apostles, when he was explaining esoteric lore, L-O-R-E, to the apostles, that one of the ways he probably did it was he used a storytelling structure and dynamic which used viticulture and winemaking as a metaphor or as part of a symbolic esoteric language. So one of the things that this tells us about Lully is that he probably knew about this esoteric or mystical Christianity alchemy tradition. And that's why he also overlaid that information in his texts onto laboratory alchemy. Because we have to remember that there was a close relationship between laboratory alchemy and the inner work. And at the time of Lully and Arnold de Villanova, when we talk about the inner work, we are specifically talking about a Christianized spiritual tradition. It may have often only been like that on the surface, but one of the things that we do know is that there definitely were esoteric organisations in Europe that had a very Christian mystical or Christian magical view of alchemy. And of course the Rosicrucians were the archetypal secret society that were both Christian and alchemical, as well as being Hermetic and having a degree of interest in the magical tradition as well. So because Lully used this winemaking and viticulture language, it's not far-fetched to make a kind of casual claim, rather than a scholarly claim, that he also was the guy who wrote the mystical texts that A.E. Waite talks about. Although I can't affirm that because I've never seen any of those texts, but I would be very curious about looking at them in order to see what kind of language that they use in order to discuss the mystical alchemy atmosphere of that time and of those individuals. So, the last thing to say about Lully is that he popped up 100 years after alchemy first came into Europe. So the tradition kind of evolved underground for 100 years before it started to become a public thing, before people started talking about it and writing texts and books about it at a serious level. 100 years of development. If a lot of texts or anything were written in that first 100 years before Lully popped up, we don't really have access to those anymore because they weren't really preserved. Then between Lully and Sir George Ripley, who was a Catholic priest in Britain, there was roughly another 100 years. So Lully presented his works about the acetate path and related alchemical ideas and practices. And then it wasn't until 100 years later, more give or take, that Sir George Ripley comes onto the scene. He understands Lully's writings and then he starts to popularise them again in his own writings about alchemy. And one of the arguments about that is that Sir George Ripley understood Lully's alchemical texts because Ripley himself was initiated by somebody who was a Lullian alchemist. When Ripley was in Italy, because he spent a bit of time in Italy travelling around looking for people who were interested in alchemy, and got involved in the court of religious individuals who were hanging out in the Vatican and with the Pope. But while he was there, he studied laboratory alchemy with somebody, and he makes that clear in his own writings. And one of the people that it is guessed that he may have interacted with and possibly was trained by was Guido di Montanore, a quite famous acetate path Italian alchemist. So either way, whether Guido di Montanore actually trained Ripley and made it possible for him to make the stone, somebody in Europe who was an acetate path alchemist and who knew the accurate view of Lully's writings passed that knowledge on to Ripley, and then Ripley back home in Britain repopularised the idea of seeing Lully as an accurate and reliable source of acetate path knowledge. And this is why now academics and scholars look at Ripley as being the main guy to re-kick off an accurate and in-depth understanding of the acetate path and of the Lullian tradition. So there's a very important connection between those two people. Raymond Lully being the source in the Western world of the acetate path tradition, and then Sir George Ripley of taking Lully's knowledge, developing it further and presenting it in new kinds of ways and in a language that was easier to understand in his time, which was in the 1400s in Britain. Then from Ripley, that Lullian tradition came down to us through history through a whole stream of important acetate path alchemists, and all of those guys, no matter what they developed and added to the tradition, they all spoke in one way or another the language of the pseudo-Lully, the original alchemist Lully, from his texts and writings. So that's about really as much as I want to say about Lully here. It's probably not a long video today, but it's important to establish this knowledge and to make the point that knowing history is seriously important when you're trying to solve the puzzle of laboratory alchemy. If you don't know the history of how laboratory alchemy developed, then you can not only believe all kinds of rubbish that people tell you about what alchemy is and what old alchemists knew and what they did, knowledge that is actually not true or inaccurate, and you could believe that stuff if you don't know the actual history of how things worked. And so the beginning of history of Western Hermetic alchemy, as I said, begins with understanding the role the Templars played and the claims that are made about them having an esoteric tradition. Then how close to that Robert of Chester was and what he did, and when we know that the very first publicized texts and knowledge of alchemy came into Europe, and then when the first actual texts were written and brought into public view, that formed a firm pathway into down through the ages into the modern tradition, with Lully and Arnold de Villanova and people like them, Guido de Montenor. Once we understand all of these things, a lot of the garbage that's talked about alchemy and a lot of the rubbish claims that are made about laboratory alchemy disappear very quickly, because we know that those things are either not true historically, there's no record of them, or that they were impossible, or that those original guys who brought the tradition into Europe and then started influencing people in such a way that a solid lineage of alchemical teaching was formed. We know what those guys knew, what they did, what they were capable of, and the way that they taught their knowledge. And it becomes a lot easier once we can focus ourselves on those guys and what they were saying, and once we start to understand the language that they use and the concepts that they discuss laboratory alchemy, it eliminates a lot of confusing garbage and allows us to focus, and we can understand a lot quicker accurate knowledge on the Western Hermetic alchemical tradition. So that is Raymond Lully, requested subject, and I think probably the next requested subject I'm going to talk about is Sir George Ripley or Samuel Norton and how important he was in the alchemical tradition. I want to talk about all three of these people because they played a major influence, and not an enormous amount is known about them in the modern popular alchemical tradition. So thanks very much for watching, and see you in the next podcast.
The path of the chosen is strewn with loss. It was always so.
The ways of the gods are mysterious. We all walk our own path, blindly through the dark, hoping one day to hear their voice, to receive their guidance. Sometimes the path is lost. Sometimes it doubles back. All we can do is keep walking in hope. Blind faith, step by step. As they watch in silence.
Behold, the will of the gods!
Watch us struggle to please them. To receive their light. All of the chosen suffer. Everyone. Their pain is the gods' joy. Their tears, the gods' laughter. For only through them can the gods' voice be heard. Because when the gods choose, they choose the lost. They choose the desperate, the forsaken, the forgotten, the nameless.
Because only those will know the true path. The path to the beyond. Only they will be able to see the real future. The real horizon.